I've got something fantastic to show you today. This is the Pentax Super Takumar 105mm f2.8. It's a portrait lens with a really old school character. This lens will give your images and your video an authentic old school look that's far more interesting and far more characterful than a modern lens could give. If you're looking for a 100mm lens with a very distinctive vintage character, check this one out. So we've looked at a few of these 100mm/105mm lenses recently, either f2.8 or f2.5 versions. We've looked at the Vivitar 100mm f2.8. That's a really capable lens, surprisingly capable actually, and very inexpensive. I bought mine for about £40, so that's about 40 pence per millimetre of focal length. That's a nice capable portrait lens. We've looked at the Olympus. That's a lovely lens with beautiful soft blur and a very delicate image. And we've looked at the Nikon 105mm f2.5, which just has a magic that's hard to explain. It can kind of take any ordinary scene and just put some magical sparkles onto it and make it look more interesting, more colourful than it does in reality. This one is different. This one has a character all of its own. I've been shooting it recently on my Sony A7C, which is a little full frame camera, and also on my Fujifilm X-T3 with a focal reducer, which is a special type of adapter that sits between the lens and the camera, and it's got a special lens in it. So what it does is it takes the light from the lens and it squishes it all down so that all of the image, or very nearly all of the image, 95 to 98% of the image, fits onto the APS-C sensor. So it behaves as a full frame lens on an APS-C sensor, and I did that just because I was curious to see how it would perform on the different cameras and on the different sensors and how that would affect the colours. But we'll come to that shortly. This is a very beautifully made lens. These Pentax lenses, the Takumars and the Super Takumars, I think these are the best engineered lenses I've ever encountered. Certainly the best engineered vintage lenses I've ever encountered. They're easily the equal of the Leica lenses that I've shot. They exceed the quality of the Nikon, Canon, Olympus lenses that I've shot. They're just the most exquisite engineering quality. This one has lived the life. It's been used. It's not been stood on a shelf and kept pristine. But even so, even though it's lived the life and it's 50 odd years old, turning that focus ring, it just feels like new. It literally feels like new. There is no point where it becomes rough or harsh at all. Everything's just beautifully fluid and it turns with a lovely clean fluid action. Same for the aperture ring. Just lovely condition. Everything about this lens in terms of mechanical condition has survived those 50 years really, really well. There were 3 versions of this lens. Apparently there was the Takumar, the Super Takumar and the Super Multi-Coated Takumar. This is a Super Takumar and it's said to be, the Super Tacs are said to be single coated. So this is the second version and it's supposed to be single coated, but actually if you look at the rear element, that one is coated as well. That's got some purpley coating on it. It's not very heavy coating like you find in later Canon lenses, for example, or earlier Helios lenses with the purple coating. So it's not a very heavy coating, but it is there and it's on all of the elements. So maybe it was that, you know, just some of these Super Tacs were single coated and then they began with multi-coated as the production went to the next phase. I think this lens has a sonar formula. As far as I can tell, it has a sonar optical formula, but do correct me if you know better. So before we go on with our analysis of this little Super Tac, please consider subscribing if you like the content and the videos on this channel. That makes it easier to keep bringing you this kind of content. And if you really like this channel, you might like to consider becoming a patron over at www.patreon.com/Zenography. That makes it more possible to bring you this kind of content too. So how does this little lens shoot? Well, I found it quite a difficult lens to begin with, and I've got to admit I didn't really get on with it to begin with. It seemed very truculent and a very awkward sort of lens, and I got to be honest, at first I found it rather difficult to squeeze anything out of it worth looking at all. It just seemed like it didn't want to play. It just didn't want to have any fun. And I just couldn't work out what was going on. But I was looking for the wrong thing. I didn't see its character properly. I was looking for a more modern rendering. And this lens doesn't give that. This is a very, very delicate lens, or rather the images it makes are very, very delicate. They're very subtle, they're very restrained, they're very understated. This lens gives a decidedly old school look straight out of the box. Wide open at f2.8, this lens is very sharp. In fact, it's surprisingly sharp. I really hadn't expected it to be as sharp as it is. It does sharpen up when you stop it down, of course, as any lens will, but not by a lot. There's not that much more detail rendered at f5.6 than there is at f2.8. So this is a very sharp lens, wide open. It's not the sharpest vintage 100mm. That honour, I think, has to go to the Nikon 105mm f2.5. I've not shot a sharper vintage lens in this focal length than that one, but it's only a hair sharper than this one. This one is not too far off it, actually, in terms of sharpness. It gives very clean images, very clear images, very nicely defined images with lots and lots of detail present right from wide open, and it's more than sharp enough to shoot wide open all day long if that's what you want to do. If you want to make maximum blurriness, this one you can shoot at f2.8 and leave it there all day and just forget it. You will get some nice detail and some nicely resolved images. All right, let's think about colour. Well, this is a Pentax, an older Pentax lens, so these colours don't shout. These older Pentax lenses with the M42 mount, the Takumars, the Super Takumars and the Super multi-coated Takumars tend to give fairly restrained, fairly delicate, in some cases almost pastel-y type colours. They're restrained, they're subtle, they don't shout, they don't put themselves right in your face. They do tend to be that bit more restrained than, for example, a Canon FD lens might give. Those colours from those lenses would be usually very saturated. These older Pentaxes take a very different approach. They vary with the lighting conditions, so depending on the light and I guess the subject, colours can be very delicate, very soft, or again dependent on the light, they can turn a bit harder, more sort of documentary, realistic feel. Think sort of 1970s 16mm movie film, that kind of feel. It gives colours that are just a little pushed towards the cool side. I wouldn't call this a warm lens. It gives cooler colours, and colours are pushed just that little bit towards the bluer end of the spectrum rather than the red. Colours can be rich and strong, but you need really good strong sunlight to give that. In those conditions, the colours gain a bit more saturation, a bit more energy, and they can really come alive actually in strong sunlight. So it's got a pretty wide repertoire of colour performance, all the way from nice and delicate pastel-y to sort of journalistic 70s feel, all the way to a bit more pumped up and saturated in good strong sunlight. So, you know, quite a repertoire. Okay, as far as contrast goes, generally this is a low contrast lens. It can be nice and strong. It can give good strong images with plenty of presence, but this lens is very, very sensitive to light. It might be the most sensitive to sunlight of all of the vintage lenses that I've shot. This lens loses contrast very, very quickly, and light catches it at the wrong angle. The big front element, light catches that at the wrong angle very, very easily. So you really need to shade, and you know, quite a few occasions while I was out shooting, I was trying to shade this lens with my hand, but it's not so easy to shade with your hand without getting it in the shot. So the best thing to do, I think, the best way to use this lens is with a hood, but it does need to be shot with some sort of shade if you want to avoid the contrast dropping out very easily. Now, the low contrast look is a beautiful aesthetic straight from the 60s and the early 70s, and you know, it's often sought out for itself. And if that's what you're looking for, this is the lens to do it. This is a naturally inherently low contrast lens, and you can provoke it to drop its contrast even further by positioning it, by being aware of the light and positioning it at a point where it just begins to catch sunlight at its front element, or whatever light you're working with on its front element, and contrast just begins to fade. You'll get a nice little bloom across the shot, reminiscent of 60s, you know, mid 60s to sort of mid or maybe early 70s photographic images, and just a lovely look. And if that's what you're looking for, this one will give it to you right out of the box. No need for processing, no need for mucking about. This has it baked in. Background blur is lovely. It's very, very smooth indeed. It's one of the smoothest lenses, vintage lenses that is, for making background blur that I've shot, and that is saying something. I've shot quite a few of these old lenses. So it's really smooth blur, and more importantly, it's reliably smooth. As the distances between camera subject and background change, this blur tends to stay on the smooth side. It doesn't always stay totally smooth. It does have vintage character, and in fact it's got plenty of vintage flaws and quirks to keep you entertained that will you know, play around in the back of a shot in the blur, but it's generally very smooth and coherent. It feels smooth and coherent. It's more smooth than the blur from the Nikon and the Vivitar lenses in this focal length. It's about the same as the Olympus. Again, similar sort of blur. The Olympus gives very, very smooth background blur. This one gives very, very smooth background blur also. Having said that, it is smooth, and that's usually considered a virtue, and it is a virtue in a lens, I guess, but I'm not sure that this blur is particularly entertaining. I think the blur from the other lenses is more interesting, more entertaining, from the Vivitar, the Olympus and the Nikon. This one, I don't know, I found it a little bit too smooth at times, and you know, that's a virtue, that's a great thing if that's what you're looking for, and usually that is what people look for. But if you want a little entertainment in the background blur, there are lenses that will give you a little more of that than this one. Although this does have some vintage flaws and quirks, it's not without them. Chromatic aberration, yeah, it's got some. It's an old 100mm vintage lens with a relatively wide maximum aperture, so yeah, it does have some chromatic aberration, and that makes itself shown if you know, there are any tree branches in the shot against the sky. You'll often see a little green fringe or a little purple fringe to either side or to one side. That's chromatic aberration, and it's caused by the lens focusing different colours, red, green and blue, at slightly different points on the sensor. I think because the wavelengths are different, wavelengths of the light are different. This has some of it. It's not as bad as the Nikon lens, the Nikon 105 f2.5. All the vintage Nikons I've shot have had pretty bad chromatic aberration. Actually, they tend to be really pretty awful for it. But this one, it's got some, but it's not so bad at all. I don't know if the Nikon lenses would perform better on film, if that's just a result of shooting them on digital sensors, but certainly this one is rather better for chromatic aberration than the Nikon 105 f2.5. You're not going to see it. It's there. You might see it occasionally, but you know, you're not going to see it too often. So in conclusion then, this is a lovely old vintage lens from Pentax. It's very sharp. It's not quite as sharp as the Nikon 105, but it is a very sharp lens nevertheless. It gives beautifully soft blur that might be a little bit less interesting than some of the other 100mm we've looked at and talked about, but still nevertheless has plenty of vintage flaws and quirks in its background blur to keep you entertained. It has colour that can be strong and solid in the right lighting conditions. It can also be rather delicate, or it can also have a journalistic feel, a sort of a harder edged feel reminiscent of the late 60s, early 70s journalistic look. Generally, it's a low contrast lens. Contrast can be really nice and strong, but it can also drop very easily if light catches the front element at the wrong angle, and that happens in either direct sunlight or diffuse light. Either will seem to set this little lens off. All in all, there are few better lenses for the 60s look than this one. If you really want that vintage look, this one will give it to you right out of the box, and a very beautiful look it is too. So I guess that's it from me for now. Many thanks for watching. If you've watched this far, a particular thanks to you. If you've enjoyed this show, you might want to chuck us a sub. That would be very much appreciated. And if you like the content on this channel and you think this guy is not doing too badly at keeping this old equipment alive and in use, then you might want to become a patron over at www.patreon.com/Zenography, and you can do that for as little as $1 per month. Many thanks to everybody who has watched, tuned in, given thanks, made a comment, given super thanks, given likes, or engaged with the channel in any way. It's all appreciated. But as from me, that's it for now. So if you're not doing anything too difficult, irksome, or bothersome next week at around this time, please do check in and join me for a spot more Zenography. Cheerio all.